Rebecca Blumenstein has done it the old-fashioned way by earning it, as those old commercials said. She started off in regional newspapers. There are many details in the program, by the way. She started off in regional newspapers in Detroit. She went to the Wall Street Journal and spent years in China, winning a Pulitzer along the way. And she's worked her way up the ranks to the top of not one, but two major news organizations. So she has a window into how America's top editors are trying to navigate these complex times. We're very lucky to have her with us today.
Many thanks for the kind words, Bill. I'm very honored to speak here today. I have to say, I've come to the OPC Scholars Lunch for several years, and it simply never ceases to inspire me. Young people entering our profession these days simply have a lot of guts. While the future of journalism may be completely unpredictable, the work of separating facts from rumor and fiction has never been more critical. Many of you in this room have displayed great courage in the very act of becoming a journalist, coming from places where a free and fair press is often considered a threat, as we just heard, and I commend you all. I had a bit of a more modest start in newspapers. Dreams of being a foreign correspondent initially drew me into journalism, but it would be a while before that happened for me. Actually, I thought that ship had sailed as I worked my way through metro papers in the suburbs of Florida and New York. I was lucky enough to work at one newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, for 22 years. I recently left for a senior position at the New York Times, which started just 2 days ago. Consequently, as excited as I am about my new position, most of these remarks will be rooted in my experience at the Journal. One of the biggest reasons I was hired at the Wall Street Journal is that I was completely enthusiastic about a position in the Journal's Detroit bureau, which many reporters probably considered a bit of a foreign assignment. I was from Michigan originally, and this sounded like a great opportunity for me, and that's one of the biggest reasons I was hired. My first beat was covering General Motors, the world's largest automaker. I'm sitting next to Ford today, and we were just discussing old Detroit days. I quickly realized that as central as it was to the U.S. economy and psyche, the auto industry was one of the world's most global industries. And it was this job that showed me what an interconnected world we live in. GM, even back in those days, made big bets in China, Mexico, and Europe that remain consequential and now very controversial today. I will forever be grateful to the Journal for the many opportunities that I had, and to many of my colleagues over the years at the Journal, particularly for sending me on my first true foreign assignment. When I was named the paper's China bureau chief and sent to Beijing, I was a mother with 3 children, ages 7 and under. The deputy bureau chief at the time, Kathy Chen, I don't know if any of you know her, she had 3 children at the time. So the China bureau was run by 2 women with a total of 6 kids. I would say that my subsequent experience working abroad was certainly the most important time of my career. Of course, it's not a secret that major news organizations are looking closely at the cost of foreign correspondence and in some cases have cut back. But I believe that foreign reporting is what will distinguish modern news organizations. Increasingly, others can replicate what we do in China or Europe or Washington, but it's the exercise of putting reporters in these places together to piece together the truth of what is happening that produces journalism that's truly worth paying for. It's also more vital than ever, particularly at a time when so many of the established norms of the global order are being challenged and are simply changing before our eyes. A retreat from covering the world would be a profound retreat. The sheer scale of the foreign story is something that one misses at their peril and cuts across all areas, certainly including business. China now boasts the world's largest market in so many areas, and many of the world's largest companies in sector after sector, from Alibaba and WeChat, whose ecosystems of e-commerce, credit scores, and entertainment have made them the envy of many tech companies in the US, to steel and many other areas. Alibaba, it's worth noting, now owns the South China Morning Post. Facebook and Google also play an ever larger role in the media landscape, both in amplifying our stories and, quite frankly, in challenging our business models, taking up to 85% of all digital advertising. There's also the inescapable interconnectedness of our global economy, which we have seen has potentially enormous political consequences. The Wall Street Journal did a series called The Great Unraveling last year, examining the economic insecurity that fueled the rise of President Trump. An analysis by Journal reporters found that in last year's Republican primary races, Mr. Trump won 89 of the 100 counties in the U.S. most affected by job losses and competition from China. There is also the story or image that gets people to care and in a moment brings to the fore a complex global problem. No one can forget the photo last year of Omran Dagnesh, a 5-year-old who was pulled out of a bomb building in Syria and placed in an ambulance. It's his face, it cannot be unseen, said the photographer who took the photo. There is also great good that can come out of the reporting strength of foreign newspapers, particularly in holding governments and companies to account in places that have long controlled the media. The Associated Press last year revealed shocking slavery-like conditions in Southeast Asia's fishing industry, which supplies seafood that we eat all over the world. People were literally held captive, a practice that did not come to an end until the AP caught it on camera. The Wall Street Journal has for 2 years documented fraud that started in Malaysia's sovereign wealth fund, 1MDB, and has mushroomed into one of the largest global financial scandals of all time, involving major banks and governments around the world. Many, many Malaysians have thanked the Journal for reporting that has been simply banned in their country. I also saw firsthand the value of reporting and influence of U.S. embassies and other journalists doing work in China. Many of Americans think of China as polluted and its workers as underpaid, but too few of us pause to consider the impact of producing all of the world's smartphones in China, or the batteries we use to power our devices. We need to consider our own role in China's pollution problems. The U.S. Embassy started tracking the fog that seemed to constantly envelop Beijing, particularly in the winter, sending out a daily tweet with a particulate amount. At first, the Chinese government tried to suppress it, as officials didn't really want to acknowledge the problem, preferring to call it fog. But eventually, authorities relented, and the daily pollution index is now a fixture of life in Beijing and cities around China. Such transparency would not have happened without the pushing of top U.S. officials or social media. As an editor who's overseen bureaus around the world, I will say there is still a rather surprising reluctance to go abroad for many reporters. I don't get that sense in this room, but it's true. I love it when a reporter walks in and asks what he or she needs to do to go abroad as soon as possible. It simply doesn't happen enough. I understand that life gets complicated, and navigating 2 careers can make moving abroad seem almost impossible. But I would also argue in many cases, including my own, that partners end up finding opportunities they wouldn't have had before. There are also different times to go abroad. I was particularly proud of sending one of our most senior correspondents, Bob Davis, to China after his kids had gone to college. He ended up being a mentor to many in the Bureau and making a lasting impact. But the job of being a foreign correspondent is only getting harder in what feels like an increasingly intensifying political climate here, in the Mideast, and almost everywhere around the world. Yaroslav Trofimov has been a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal since 1999, covering the Mideast, Africa, and Asia. He's also served as the Journal's bureau chief in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and now travels almost constantly around the region to write a weekly column called Middle East Crossroads that delves into the complexities of the region. And by the way, Yarrow has a reputation for always putting safety ahead of the story, which is essential given the dangers that he faces on a constant basis. Yarrow's view of his job these days is quite revealing, and I'm quoting him. "We are living in the age of ideologues, and especially populist ideologues, thriving on hostility against the quote-unquote other. Our job as foreign correspondents is to explain that the reality is far more complex than what the ideologues would make it out to be, and that the quote-unquote others are just as human, with complicated motivations and needs as we are. Nowhere is this more important than in the Muslim world, which elicits so much fear of that other, fear that is now being exploited by the purveyors of self-serving ideology who want to reduce people's identities to their faith." There is perhaps no one who better understood the need for this than Danny Pearl, the Wall Street Journal correspondent who was kidnapped and murdered by Pakistani terrorists now 15 years ago. Danny covered telecom, earthquakes, elections, terrorist attacks, But he was famous for his sense of humor and finding the detail, the smell, and the feel of a place that connected the world to the people of that place. After being sent to spend a month in Iran covering the elections in the summer of 1997, for example, he came back with an A-head, that's the journal's funny story on the front page, about a town that wanted to build the world's biggest carpet. His lead from Ben Iran, and this was at a time when his editors really wanted him to do an election story, was rather, "This is a small town in search of a really big floor." He also believed deeply in not judging people by their faith and sect, and his belief resonates today more than ever. If any of you haven't read the book of his stories, I would recommend doing it because it's incredible how current and resonant it is today. His wife, Marianne, described it as this: "For us, for Danny, journalism epitomized the path for charting a better world future. Danny cherished the truth more than anything. He called it his religion. He had taken a lifelong struggle against conventional wisdom. In all these respects, Danny was a hero, an ordinary hero. It is our job as foreign correspondents and those who support them to continue Danny's legacy, holding the powerful to account and sharing the stories of the people and places with a world that needs them more than ever. I look forward to the many great stories to come from the OPC scholars and from all of you. Thank you very much."
We have time for me to ask a couple of questions. Rebecca, what does it feel like to be at senior levels of these news organizations as they're coping with the economic realities, the internet, social media? Can you give us any flavor for what is the nature of the debate? What is the nature of the discussion?
Well, that's a good question. There's no question it's a challenging time for traditional media organizations. As I was explaining to some colleagues earlier, the drop in print advertising has been especially precipitous, and it's hit all newspapers. And what we have to do is make hard choices between coverage, and what we're trying to do as much as possible is to preserve original work on the ground in places around the world. Obviously, the Trump administration and the new president are requiring lots of resources, but we also urgently need to reform ourselves to tell news in completely different ways. And so doing it in the old way with words on a printed page just isn't sufficient anymore. So it's, as anyone knows who works at the top of a news organization, there's a lot of blocking and tackling and needing to make choices about what to invest in. But I think that one of the most encouraging things I have to say against that backdrop is that since the election, and witness this room here, people are subscribing in greater numbers to newspapers, to news products that we've seen in a very, very long time. And that gives me a lot of faith. And we look at the numbers every day, and it's always the most original story, the scoop, the story that nobody else has that gets the most orders, the most traffic, the most subscribers. So I think that the past year has really taught people the value of journalism in ways that I haven't seen for a long time, and I find that very encouraging even as we're having to all make very difficult choices.
And one last question is, we pride ourselves on our set of values about speaking truth to power and about being a defender of an American democracy. And we share that with ourselves, but have we done a good enough job of persuading the American people that we play an important role in this democracy? And if we haven't done a good enough job, how could we do a better job?
I think that we could always do a better job. I'm struck sometimes, even during the course of the election, we would get, at the Journal, we would get criticism for why we had not inserted this picture or this fact into a story when they had happened very late in the night, and people didn't really understand that there's a 2-star version of the Wall Street Journal that goes out at 7:30, and the newspapers are updated. I think that there is a great challenge that we face in really explaining what we do, in explaining the difference between true facts and fake facts and you know, the whole current debate about what is true and fake, and the reality that at news organizations there is a vetting and standards and accountability for accuracy that doesn't exist if you know, bloggers, for many people who are in more the fake news industry. So we have to do an incredibly, you know, we have to do a very, you know, put much more into convincing people that something that you read, you know, whether it's Reuters or Bloomberg or the New York Times, is simply worth more and has more credibility than some of the other purveyors of fake news, because there's obviously a lot of confusion out there, and it's not everybody else's fault. It's partly our fault for not explaining it more. I will say, though, that I see greater receptivity. It's interesting what Facebook and Google and others are doing to try to stop trending stories if they're not accurate. And this is going to be very interesting terrain to watch, but I think the public now realizes that they can't simply believe everything they read on social media, and this is an opportunity for us as professional journalists to really, in a sense, teach them the value of what we do.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for being here. Please support the Overseas Press Club Foundation, because we stand for a lot of the values that we've talked about here today, about the values of putting young people on the ground in difficult places and getting the real stories. So please support us around the year and help us continue this fight. Thank you very much.